Welcome everyone to our latest episode of Leading with Agility. I'm joined as always by my co-host TK.
Hello and welcome to this new attire of Leading with Agility. You might have not seen us yet, but here we are.
Here we are indeed. This is a completely new format for us, isn't it?
The format's the same, but the formatting's different, isn't it?
Exactly. On video.
We have some plans. We're on video. We are using different microphones, and hopefully you're still going to hear the TK signature sound.
Exactly. Well, it's been a while since our last podcast. We're back again. And today, well, before we get into today's topic, I think we should acknowledge we've had quite a few new followers, haven't we, TK?
Oh, yes, plenty of new followers. Thank you so much for joining and subscribing to our wonderful podcast. Hopefully you are happy listening to our smooth voices and talking and listening about leadership.
Exactly. So thank you. It's really humbling, and we really appreciate all of you for liking, following and subscribing, and of course sharing it with others out there. So please continue to do that. So I suppose to kind of signpost you, if you're new to the podcast, do check out our first introductory episode describing what Leading with Agility is all about and agile leadership. And I think it's a nice introductory kind of episode to just get you into what we're all about, isn't it, TK?
Indeed. And I think also check out our other episodes. So all our episodes are hopefully an amazing listen, as will this one be.
Yes. So today we're going to be talking about, well, in the news this week, in the last week, as you may have gathered, I'm a bit of a Liverpool fan. So we've had the news that the Liverpool manager, Jurgen Klopp, has decided to step down, hasn't he, from his role as manager of the club. And he cited reasons of having just not enough energy in the role anymore, which was quite a shock to a lot of people, I think.
Also known in various circles as burnout, I guess.
It is. Something we're going to come to later. We'll talk in more detail.
Forecasting, foreshadowing.
Exactly. We'll talk in more detail about what burnout is all about, and a bit more about maybe symptoms, where that happens, etc. But yeah, I think just starting with that and a bit of context. He came into the club in 2015.
2015, I remember it really well. Not that I'm a Liverpool fan. I don't mind Liverpool, but there's a personal connection. Later on,
maybe. Yeah, he came to the club and he's been quite successful. Even if you're not a football fan, he has had an impact in the wider culture of Liverpool as a city as well. He got freedom of the city as well, which is a big deal. A civil award, isn't it?
Yes.
He won't get parking fines. That's what freedom of the city means.
Wow.
In real terms, amongst other things.
Good to know.
Exactly. But yeah. So he has had quite an impact, and I think, as you said, raises questions about burnout and what causes it. But he said, in his own words, he just doesn't have the energy to continue in the role anymore. I think that's quite a refreshing, honest kind of take from someone in such a high pressure role. I mean, you don't see that often, where someone says, you know what, I'm going to leave. We're doing really well. We're on a high, but it's time for me to go.
And I'll put a snippet of the video right here.
It is that how can I say that I'm running out of energy. I have no problem now. Obviously, I think I know it already for longer, that I will have to announce that at one point. But I'm absolutely fine now. But I know that I cannot do the job again and again and again and again.
So as you've just seen the video of a bit of the video that Jurgen Klopp was saying,
yes,
even like looking at him, you can clearly see that he has on energy.
Yeah,
right? And there's like when I first saw it, I thought, well, okay, he doesn't have to really say anything.
Yeah, I watched the full interview, so I know you've just shared the clip, but I watched the full interview. You can watch that on YouTube. I'm sure we'll maybe signpost it in our episode description, as we always do. And just listening to him and some of the things he was talking about, it was very clear for him. It's about, he felt he got to a point where last season, from a footballing perspective, team weren't doing very well. Came into this season a refreshed team, but what he was saying is when they started doing their planning for the forthcoming season and all the activities outside of the playing side of things, it just dawned on him. He said, you know what, I just don't want to be here anymore. And he wasn't expecting the thought.
Yeah.
And so he then had to have a bit of reflection, thought
Agile
about
leader
it.
reflects.
Agile leader, yes, we do talk about that a lot. Agile leader reflecting. So he did that reflection. He talked to people close to him, and I think he came to the decision that it's a real thought, it's a real feeling, and I don't think this is right for me, and I'm going to make the decision. So he spoke to the club in November, his leadership, and they were very supportive, although shocked. So I wanted to, I think, start off with maybe a bit broadly, looking at that type of role. It's a high performing leadership role, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely right. Sports at this level, it's terribly
Elite.
high performing,
Elite
indeed, and the spirit of competition, right? You don't always. I mean, some businesses have it, but it's like literal every Sunday or every other day when you play, you actually see the feedback live, and there's so much demand, and you see the people that are actually the consumers of your wonderful performance, right? As Arif said, the culture of the city is so tied to the football club, so huge pressure.
Yeah, definitely a lot of pressure. And so there's something to be said for that type of role of leadership and the impact it has. Now, a couple of years ago, for listeners out there, they probably don't know. We should get this on the website now, but I wrote a LinkedIn article on Klopp's leadership style. Yes. I'm a big fan, as you may have gathered already. And so there's a couple of quotes that I reference in that article, and I want to read them out. And I think that just tells you, I think it just paints a picture now, in retrospect, as to why he used the word energy in his kind of reason for leaving, saying that I don't have the energy. So here's one thing he said. He said, describing his style and of leadership, right? He said, I give everything and I expect my players to give everything. Then we see what we get. That creates the mentality of the team. So, I mean, he's really clearly just telling us, in those words, that his philosophy is about putting all the energy into what he does in order to get the maximum outcome and output from his players. I mean, that's pretty full on, right?
It's quite true. And in our circles, we call it modeling the behavior you're expecting, right? So he gives everything and expects everything from the players as much as they can actually manage. And also it just sets this culture in the club, which is obviously a thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And well, I mean, and you see it. Okay, I know we're not talking about the football side of it, but just very briefly, his footballing style epitomizes what he's talking about there. It is high energy football. That's what he's known for. And the German term he uses for that type of football, gegenpressing, is all about full on, being very high performing throughout the game, pressing the other team and all the rest of that. So anyway, enough about the football. We're not here to talk about football. We're here to talk about leadership.
Football's cool, by the way. I know nothing about it.
But I thought we should just give that context. Yeah. So, and then another thing he said, I believe in a playing philosophy that is very emotional, very fast, and very strong. So emotion is very important to his leadership style, and that can be seen. It takes a toll on someone. And so 2000, how many years he's been there? And I suppose if you again the context of a season where he had not the best on pitch performance, and he mentioned that in his leaving video. He said, "Look, that made me think a bit about, is this something I want to be doing a lot, because it takes so much out of me." So it's clearly, and we know, yes, elite sport, we mentioned that it takes a lot out of people anyway. But yeah, so there is something, but I think with all of that, there is something about his self-awareness that I think we could spend a bit of time on talking, that led him to have this reflection, that led him to realize for himself that I'm going to go out on my terms when it's right for me and not based on the environment. And maybe that I have a leadership who will support me in whatever decision I make. So I can go to them, I can have an honest conversation, and I'm not going to be, force down something.
As I'm sure he had. Right?
So I don't know. What do you think about all of that, TK?
It's very interesting in terms of living on your own terms, because it's not only the club leadership, the owners of the club, and the players, but it's also the community of fans and the city itself, right? So sometimes, and quite often, a leader has a huge burden, a huge chip on their shoulder. And in this case, you've got a situation where, there's so many people that are, very tight to you, right? So a very senior leader like this, when leaving, it's a shock. So I'm really personally incredibly amazed by him just saying that. And, it's obviously a huge reflection. I think he is quite loved. Community, city, club, fans, because he operates with feelings. And it's just, I don't want to distract it, but I had the same feeling when Jacinda Ardern has been quitting as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, right? A well-revered leader, saying she's got nothing left in the tank.
Yeah.
And what surprises me is, first of all, it's a huge and amazing example of leadership and, going on your own terms. It's a great example of reflection, but also putting your own mask first before you help others. Okay. Because you can't do much if, and clearly how you've seen, Jurgen, you're in a state of burnout. You're hurting people that you sometimes love.
Yeah, no, it's a interesting. You mentioned another example of Jacinda Ardern. So I don't know. Maybe we can. Are there any other stories we can share of experiences where either perhaps we've seen it in others close to us, or we've seen the impact on how it's affected teams of people in an organizational setting? I don't know. Have you got?
So when you've seen burnout, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that
I have some. But
I've seen people burn out. I've as a professional coach, I work with quite a few of these people. That actually, and I spoke about it on the Coach on the Rocks.
Yeah,
it's for me, first of all, when you're burnt out, is just to acknowledge it, because I myself, as a leader, don't. And I have this ethics of, pushing because things just need to happen. There's the imperative, and, I don't always care for myself, and it can have an impact on well-being, on mental health, because there were times I've pushed myself far too much on some things that didn't really matter. But I think what I see with people is when they actually raise this, what I will say is, senior leaders actually appreciate it, because I think in the long run, if the burnout is happening for you, if you actually indicate that it is, and you take some precautions, it's better for the bottom line that you did, instead of trying to endure and soldier on. TK's time, right? Don't do it.
Well, I've got some stuff on burnout that I've been looking at that we'll talk about. One of the things that one of the other things that I think is interesting is that I had an example of a leader I worked with how many years ago now, before the pandemic this was, and I think looking back, I think I would say he was suffering from that burnout but it came out in a really toxic way. So he was under so much pressure and stress to perform or show results that it came out in a way where he was in a meeting with the team and he just lost his cool at not seeing the results that he wanted.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so that was an extreme example, but it's one that I've seen and that had repercussions for him, of course. But I think that was a case of the pressure that he put himself under, or maybe the environment that he was in, creating that pressure that meant it was really difficult for him to operate, as we talk about in the leadership circle, from a place of creativity rather than reactivity, right? Yeah. So he's not in control of his leadership style. He was clearly being driven by the environment, and that had an impact on how he was behaving. But going back to where we came from this, I think that there is something to be said, as I said, about Klopp's relationship with his senior leadership team, who've employed him, who are there to look after him, that he's and when I was watching his full leaving interview, he made it quite clear that, look, I went to them in November, had a conversation. They weren't happy, but they supported me, and they said, look, we understand.
Be happy about it. Yeah.
And it's interesting. There's a human side to it, because he said, look, I've been doing this for so long. I don't know what life outside of this looks like. I've not had my own life outside of managing football teams as an adult. That's what he was basically making the point. So he said, before it's too late, I want to look after my own health. I want to look after my own, I suppose, mental health, and I want to go and do something for myself.
It's quite true. It's an interesting one. What happens to a person in a high-pressure environment when you make this decision and you finally leave, and there's a huge celebration and everyone is appreciating it, but then again, you've got a situation where suddenly you find yourself without this adrenaline, without this rush of things happening, and how do you find a place for yourself?
Yeah.
How do you manage to rest? How do you recover from burnout if you made the right decision, stepped back in any shape or form, but it's probably somewhere later on?
So with that in mind, I think we can let's move. We've talked about burnout a few times. We've mentioned it a couple of times. So let's go into that a bit more detail. Where does this term come from? Apparently, reading some stuff, it comes from. It goes back to the 1970s. There has not been a actual clear, I don't know, definition of it, but the World Health Organization did come out with a definition, and I'll read it out. They said burnout is characterized by 3 dimensions: low energy, exhaustion, and increasingly negative feelings about work, and reduced professional effectiveness.
That's work burnout. We can have other kinds of burnout, by the way, but usually it's in work context.
We're talking about work context, aren't we? So, I don't know. How do you react to that definition, TK? What do you think?
Well, the WHO know what they're doing,
I'm
right?
sure they
and I think the way I react to it is maybe it misses some of the components you spoke about, right?
Yeah.
Reduce effectiveness is a mild way of saying that people start losing control of what they're doing, and their effect. Sometimes, they're just so tired that they're just getting back to their basic instincts. And been burned out more than once before. I remember I worked at the bank, and as always in banks, especially large organizations, some processes are just ridiculous. And I remember someone I worked with was telling me about this ridiculousness they've seen. And I said to him, look, mate, I can't handle it anymore. I understand it's ridiculous, but I am numb even to the silly and comedic nature of it, right? I just can't take it anymore. There's so much to do. We have a tight deadline. It's a bit of a crunch period. I felt burnt out, but, it's like working in creative arts, working in publishing, working in technology. There's deadlines. There's go lives, publishing dates, and sometimes you feel they're immovable. And, you just have to soldier on until you drop that on the deadline.
Yeah, exactly. So it takes a toll on people. And I think the professional. So there's some other thinking out there that I wanted to share with our audience. So listening or watching. So there is this view, I suppose, and we've touched on a little bit, that it's about the person, and that yes, it's because of what they're going through, and maybe their mental health and all the rest of it, which is true. But there are some other, let's say, scientists out there who have a different perspective, and they think it is down to the workplace and organizational culture. Now, this kind of touches a bit more in kind of the stuff we've been talking about, isn't it, around leadership culture and organizations and so on. So it's interesting. And so there's a survey Gallup ran around burnout, and they shared their results. Their top 5 reasons that people gave for burnout were unfair treatment at work was one. Unmanageable workload, another one. Lack of role clarity, lack of communication and support from their manager, and finally, unreasonable time pressure.
It's interesting because you would expect things like unmanageable workload and unreasonable time pressure to be at the top. but it isn't.
Yeah.
But you've got other things like unfair treatment and lack of moral clarity.
Yeah.
One would say, what does it have to do with burnout? But
Yeah.
it does have a lot, and a lot of the people I work with actually, that just reminds me, and as I'm reading it, I've got one coaching client that this is her top reason, which is like, but yeah, it's really true.
It's really true. So it exists, and so then the question now is, okay, but we started talking about Klopp, and he's talking about his own
Definitely
energy
knows
levels,
his own role, right?
He knows his role very well. He leads, I would say, a high performing team. Right? We wouldn't disagree with that. We talked about his own leadership being very supportive. Right? We've talked about all of that. So how does that fit with these reasons then? So because it's not the workplace culture. That's interesting. So then the only thing I would say it's probably, unmanageable workload because of the fact that the pressure of that elite sport environment creates, and it's not necessarily the club maybe explicitly creating it, but implicitly creating it through the history, the culture of the club, etc., the fans. So that all creates that environment.
But there's more, Arif. Sometimes a leader creates this culture for themselves.
That maybe
because
that's true.
They do believe in their work ethic, the culture of work, that you're supposed to give everything. If we just quoted Jurgen.
Yeah.
So, it's like obviously. But on the other hand, what choice does he have if he wants to have excellent teams?
He wants, and if you want to be successful in that environment, that's the cost.
Which is highly competitive by definition, right?
Exactly, that's the cost of it. So maybe football is an edge case, and that doesn't typify most organizations, especially for our listeners and viewers.
Actually, personally, I think if you're a leader and you want your organization to be successful in any kind of business, theoretically, you might be tempted to take the example of Jurgen. I'm not necessarily saying of reflecting, which you should, but also giving your best and expecting your best, right?
Yeah.
This theoretically sounds like a cliche standard, doesn't it?
I suppose what you're saying is so as he said, I put everything into it. He puts all his emotions into it. Now, that might not be applicable for every leader out there, but what is that to you in what you're doing? What does that look like for you in your context?
I personally think it should be applicable to most leaders, if not all, because if you're not putting and I'm not saying, look, burnout, right, and go all the way in terms of making sure you are burning yourself up, but just be yourself at work. And if it means that you need to be emotional as you are, you're a full human being, do it. I think it's applicable in any industry. And if you're hiding that, you probably are burning out because you're pretending to be someone else. But it's just my side note.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And it gives us a lot to think about in terms of leadership style. And on that kind of theme, as we were just saying earlier, with those 5 reasons, there are, and I will, as we always do, we'll put the links and the resources in the episode description. So do look into that when you have a moment. But there are other researchers out there who, as I said, believe that this is workplace related, right? So just to close that loop a bit more, there is something called the motivation hygiene theory. Yeah. I don't know if you've heard of that. I think you have, TK, haven't you? So that describes essentially that, what the difference between what motivates us versus what basic needs are being met in order to maintain job satisfaction. Okay. And so going back to some of those points around, okay, I don't know what my role is. I'm not clear about that, and the communication isn't very clear between me and my line manager or the leader I work for. The workload not being manageable. So
that's true. But I'll hold on, if I may, speak about this thing about the role clarity, right? Because there are 2 sources of burnout in these examples that you just gave, right?
Yeah.
Unmanageable workload. Yeah. You're just tired. You're just excessively exerting yourself over a long period of time. And it's just obviously taking a toll. But the lack of clarity on role or the lack of support is you're burning out through a lot of anxiety. Not great. Seen people doing this. I've done it myself. Watch out for that. There's a different underlying source, and I've talked about it in the Coach on the Rocks. Sometimes this goes hand in hand. You think you're burnt out, but your root cause is actually having a lot of anxiety, and you should look into that.
Okay, no, that's an interesting one. So what as I was saying earlier, so that this, if we apply this theory to those kind of reasons, right, as to where reasons for burnout that people are giving, and that's what the survey tells us. Then then what does this mean for leaders, right? This means something around how you lead and what you're doing with your team, or how you're leading your team. To really think about some of these really basic stuff is, okay, how are you communicating with your team? So there's some examples I was reading around, so there was one interesting one. One company decided they were going to build a basketball court on the roof of their building, right? So they built it. The employees weren't using it. They weren't using it, and they were wondering why. This had been built, and when they were surveyed or asked afterwards, tell us what all this was. They said, look, we didn't want the basketball court. All we needed was XYZ, and it was something completely different, and it just affected them, because it was like, why didn't you just talk to us?
Spending money for something that they feel they don't need.
So why don't you just talk to us, have a conversation? We would have told you what we actually wanted, rather than you going spending millions of pounds building a basketball court on the top of this building. So that's just an example, a really funny, silly example, but costly one. As to how important it is for leaders out there, and we talk about this in the work we do, right? So we talk about creating the right team environment, the right culture for your team, where how are decisions being made? Who's making them? Are you collaborating enough with your team when it comes to decision making? And if you're not doing that, then these are going to be some of the symptoms, I would say.
Absolutely, and I think as always, I'm touching upon modeling behavior, right? I don't think that anyone's really immune from burnout. It can happen to any of us. So if the culture is that the senior leaders just soldier on, instead of like saying, okay, fine, it's gone too far, I need a break, or I need to properly rest, they will model this behavior in other people. So again, like with everything, the leaders, are responsible for modeling the right behavior. And I think showing that burnout can happen, it's okay to say you're burnt out, and it's important to deal with it. The example has to come through you. Not only through saying that, because you're not immune, you don't have a pass to being burnt out and just soldiering on. You need to set the right example. Yeah,
no, exactly. So, so with that in mind, I suppose we should maybe start thinking of some thoughts around, how can leaders create some of this in terms of avoiding these kind of miscommunications, having the right conversations essentially with their teams to avoid some of these reasons, like role clarity or a lack of it, and the comms. What kind of thoughts can we share?
I think that's separate, right? Role clarity and supporting, I think it's a bit of a separate topic. And I think it's like, it seems obvious, like help people to be clear about their role and often communicate your expectations.
Yes.
That's the easier bit. Now, when it comes to the bit about the excessive workload, you have a difficult balance to strike.
Okay.
On one hand, the agile leader's second principle is chasing value, right? Always being focused on value.
Yeah.
And some would say that, it's like big workload can generate bigger value for many cases, right? So you have the balance to strike.
And the balance on that is one of the other reasons is the unreasonable time pressure. Now, so from thinking from an agile leadership point of view, we that's something we're big on in terms of how work should happen. And we are quite focused, as we do in the work we do, around iteratively delivering work, right? That's key to agile principles, and it's key to what we think leaders should embed in the culture of the work they do. Is focusing on how do you iterate around the work. So then that pressure becomes a different type of pressure, I think, which is, okay, what's something we can do that's manageable, but also gives us some value, like you said, and we can test it, we can get some results, and then we can build on it.
Many people actually say that working in an agile way is difficult for them. There's a thing called sprint that many people mention, which is obviously running, right? Yeah. How long can you sprint? Is this the right word to use? We encourage to use different
the word iterations.
We use the word iterations instead because it's much better than sprint.
Yeah.
And recommendation to all of you that might want to take this upon. But I think iterations help. Iterations. What helps me when iterating is always knowing there is a next iteration. So I'll give you an example. So this podcast. It's interesting. We've started really slow. We started with every podcast episode, I was slightly improving my technique of, the engineering of it, audio and such. Now video, I'm sure that this one will have some small mishaps and will improve for next time.
Yeah.
But Arif also has been great in his artistic direction and improving his scripts and ideas. So I tend to say, look, right, okay, I need to get the podcast out for the deadline when we publish it. Good enough is good enough. Okay, it's fine. I'll improve the next time. I'll improve for the next podcast episode, and I will improve my technique. I got a new microphone, not this one, but for instance, always improve. There's always the next time.
There's always the next time, right? And you can always do it better, and it will be easier because you're building upon your experience. So this is why iterations are great. Yeah. So I think that's those are some tips in terms of how you can reduce that kind of mental time pressure, that I think is just unnecessary, but we do appreciate, we understand it's typical, it's normal. Organizations set themselves deadlines. They want to see outcomes, they want to see outputs being delivered and for certain reasons, business reasons. That's always the case. But as a leader, it's about, okay, I know there is something there. What's the outcome we're trying to get towards, right? Let's not focus too much on the output at this point. What's the outcome we're trying to get towards? And how do we, as you said, iteratively work our way to deliver something that is, as you say, good enough is good enough by the time it needs to be delivered.
And
right?
also, it's a definition of what good enough is good enough, because
that's relative.
As we know, for certain pieces of software like LinkedIn, I'm not giving this example again, it can be quite different. But yes.
It's relative to your organization, of course.
And I think it's all about, if you're working in an agile way, reflection is a huge part of it. So every iteration, there is an opportunity to reflect.
And that's your leadership style as well.
It is.
How are you reflecting? And in taking that inspiration from Jurgen, doing that reflection, constantly improving how he's leading his team, how he's managing his team, etc. And then on himself as well, realizing, okay, what can I do for myself now? And now is the time. Yes. I need to make some decisions.
But watch out. Many agile leaders, especially when they're working with agile processes, are so focused on these wonderful games, toys, and the process of reflecting, than the actual truth of people really saying their mind and really being open about what happens, right? It's much more important to acknowledge the fact that there are things that are difficult to talk about, and it's an open space, than to bring in a new game, which may be fun, but might be a distraction.
Indeed. One other thing, I suppose, is the lack of communication. So we touched on that as well. And I mentioned briefly around there's something there around how decisions are being made and how you're not involving the right people or not having them. With your, as you said, TK, with some of the people you've been coaching recently, what kind of aha moments have you heard, or what kind of thoughts have you encountered from the people you've been coaching around some of this, around maybe the lack of communication they have with their managers, or anything you want to share with our audience today?
So communication goes both ways.
Yes.
Ask and you might be given.
Yes.
If you don't ask for a clear definition of your role, people will think you're fine. If you don't say you're burnt out, people will think, oh, you're soldiering on. That's okay, right? Not everyone is a high-performance leader just yet, or a leader of leaders. We're not all perfect human beings. you and I are also sometimes struggling. It is important to ask and say what you need.
Yeah.
Without that,
nothing happens, isn't it?
well, it will happen if you have an amazing leader that can actually read the situation and be able to see deep into your soul. Sadly, these are rare.
So do talk, do rate. Yeah,
Yes.
but I think, and then there's the flip side, which is from a leadership point of view, are you creating an environment that makes it easy for your team members to, ask these type of questions, to, come to you with those challenges? So if you have that right environment, then it's more likely that you're going to get them telling you, okay, what we really need is this.
Yeah.
And I know you're making this decision, but it's not going to help because X, Y, Z, you're not listening to what we want and so on. What we think is this is the right approach, or this is what we want to do. So it goes back to what we've said before, which is the right culture that you're creating, the right environment you're creating, and making it more conducive, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. I'm just sometimes
spacing out there.
Well, it's not that I'm spacing out because
I'm thinking
about it, digesting it, but also it's an interesting thing when, as a leader, you have many roles, right?
Yeah.
And if, for instance, you're recording a podcast and you're not only thinking about the topic of the podcast and leadership, but also thinking about, is Arif in the right spot for his autofocus on the camera? Because I can see it slightly, hopefully it's focused on you and not the wonderful plant behind you. But, this also can be a problem and an unsustainable workload.
You're getting distracted, TK.
Yes.
So with that in mind, let's think about some of the lessons and maybe some of the key kind of thoughts that we've been sharing today. How would we summarize what we've been talking about today, TK?
So what we've been talking about essentially is burnout can happen to anyone, and you just need to make sure that it's something that you are open and happy to talk about. But also, what I think I would summarize is there's two different reasons, like overall reasons for burnout, which is one, anxiety, two, workload.
Yeah.
These are separate and have separate roots. They can be very intertwined, and I've seen them both.
Yeah.
And damn, I suffered from both.
And I think the other side of it, as we've talked about, is the environment you're in, right?
Yes.
It's the workplace culture. What are your leaders doing? And so for the leaders out there listening, watching, something to really think about is what environment in culture are you creating that maybe is contributing to some of these stressors and burnout from possibly occurring. So responsibility is on you as well as it is on your staff. But it is definitely on you to really create the right environment, as we always say. And that's been a constant theme for us. So, okay. Great as always to have this kind of conversation and to ponder and think and use what's happening out there in the real world as a way to think about these ideas and discuss them and ponder over them. So I hope everyone out there's enjoyed watching and listening to this episode.
Hope so too. And thank you so much for the AB Studio in Tooting for hosting us today. I've lived in Tooting for 2 years and it's a wonderful vibe. And hopefully you're enjoying the results and hopefully, and Arif, thank you for the tea.
A lot of hopefullys. But yes, we'll see you on the next episode. Please do like, subscribe, and follow as always, and
all these wonderful things.
And all these
that
wonderful
you do in
things,
social
exactly.
media,
And
yes.
we'll see you around in the next one. Thank you very much.
See you.